All right, we're live. Welcome. This is episode 20 of Traditional Right Live. It's been quite a bit longer than 20 weeks that we've been doing this. We like our breaks now and then, so thanks for sticking with us. I'm your host Brent, and I've got the usual casting crew with me. I've got Jeff. How are you, Jeff?
Hey, good evening. I'm good.
I've got John and William S. Lind.
And tonight, instead of our usual port, because it's a hot summer night, we've got gin and tonics. Very colonial, I think.
There you go. Very nice. I've got a couple emails. I think that we can start off with that. Again, if you want to participate in the show, you can drop us a line at traditionalright@gmail.com. We'll read your questions and comments live and address them. So let me bring up the first one. First one is from Komodo. He says, "Good morning. When you gentlemen do another show, could you briefly discuss how vicious things have become since 2016? I was taken by surprise myself." He's currently on chapter 4 of Victoria.
Very good. Always delighted to find somebody else reading Victoria, which unfortunately is probably going to prove prophetic. Things have gotten really nasty because both sides are proceeding to the extreme. This is what normally happens in this kind of, I might call it pre-revolutionary situation, sort of Weimar America. As the center disappears and everyone moves to either a left extreme or a right extreme, it gets very nasty and very personal. That's just how it goes. I would rather like to see some civility return, but that's very difficult when you've got a left that immediately rabidly denounces anyone who disagrees with them as morally evil, another Hitler. Well, at that point, there's not a whole lot of middle ground. So it's part of the era that we're caught up in, and it's likely to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, do you think that the quote-unquote extreme right is really only seen as such because the Overton window has shifted so far to the left?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's very much true. And it's also because in the mainstream media, you see the term extreme right all the time. But how often do you see the term extreme left?
Never.
Right.
Although, this is sort of related. Trump was kind of making noises about classifying Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. I tend to think that nothing will happen on that, but that idea is kind of getting out there into the mainstream.
Well, they openly promote violence against people on the right. So
they said that since they have no organizational structure, that they can't be classified as such, but I'm sure that they do.
Of course they have an organizational structure. It's decentralized, but there most certainly is an organization.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's on Craigslist.
Yes, and note that, for example, as even the New York Times reported, at Charlottesville, it was the left that started the violence.
Yeah.
The right is coming prepared for it, but it's not starting it. It's prepared because it knows it's going to be attacked. Mm-hmm. And the same was true fairly recently in Portland. And so the Antifa, yeah, they take the offensive. They're not there just to defend if the right gets violent. They start the violence, yeah. And their doctrine calls for that.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. The next one is from Lewis. He's got two emails here that are related, so I'll just kind of summarize a little bit. It says, does anyone on the panel have an opinion of Poland/Central Europe and how the Catholic Church is functioning from a political, cultural standpoint? I'm asking because on the American Conservative website, Rod Dreher is giving a completely different impression of the church in Poland than this gentleman is, and he provides a link to an article from Crisis magazine. Dreyer is acting as if Christian culture is collapsing, and this gentleman says Central Europe is now the bulwark of Western civilization, and the Polish public is actually rejecting cultural Marxism. Who's right, and what's your take on this, Bill?
Well, I think they're both right. In other words, Dreyer is right about the West in the sense of Western Europe and the United States, the West as it was during the Cold War. But remember that Central Europe was under Marxism for half a century and more. And so it's not real keen on more Marxism, whether it's of the cultural or the economic variety. And the Catholic Church developed, particularly in Poland, but not only in Poland, in Central Europe, tremendous legitimacy through the Cold War because it was the center of resistance to the communists. So, yeah, I've spoken, I haven't been to Poland, but I've spoken at a number of military colleges in Central Europe, and looks like I'll be speaking at another one in November. And the attitude there is completely different because of their experiences with Marxism. And the last thing they want is another variety of Marxism thrust down their throats. In fact, there was just an article in today's New York Times, of course the Times was screaming over this, about how there's tremendous resistance in Poland to the gay agenda and the gay movement, that when they try to have gay marches, they're frequently showered with eggs and insults and so forth. And the Catholic Church came right out and said, this is against God. Specifically, the gay agenda is against God, not the resistance to it. So there's a completely different picture of the second half of the 20th century and the lessons from that in Central Europe than there is in Western Europe and the United States.
Great. Yeah, that's our last email. So thanks for those. And if you want to participate, traditionalright@gmail.com is the best way to send us an email. But I also periodically check the live chat while we're live, so that's a good way to participate directly into the conversation that we're having right now. So, Bill, what's the first piece of news you have?
Okay, the first piece of news is, as our regular viewers and listeners will know, on several of our earlier shows, I talked about the fact that the claims for asylum of these hundreds of thousands of refugees from Central America pouring over our southern border are prima facie illegitimate, because asylum is for individuals who are being persecuted by their government, and you claim it as soon as you come to another country. In other words, the first country you come into after getting out of your own, where you're being persecuted, you ask for asylum. Well, interestingly, and perhaps this is just coincidence, or perhaps somebody in the White House is listening to us, President Trump just did exactly that. And he announced that those claims were going to be considered illegitimate because the people had not applied for asylum in the first country they came to. And in fact, the New York Times from yesterday, Saturday, has a piece about how it says Trump and Guatemala agree to put the brakes on Central American migrants, and specifically on this issue. President Trump on Friday again sought to block migrants from Central America from seeking asylum, announcing an agreement with Guatemala to require people who travel through that country to seek refuge from persecution there instead of the United States. And this is exactly what we're talking about. And it notes, by the way, that more than 144,200 migrants were taken into custody at the southwest border in May, the highest monthly total in 13 years. So if the problem is that American judges have said that as soon as an illegal gets onto American soil, if he says, I claim asylum, he has to be given a court hearing. Well, the courts are backed up for years. This is why we've been keeping them in camps to the degree we can. But the numbers, when you're getting 144,000 a month, you can't put them all in camps. So they're released, they disappear into the millions of illegals already here. Of course, they never show up for the hearing, and they're here permanently. And as long as they can play this asylum scam, which is what it is, we're going to continue with this problem. So the president has acted on this, and specifically along the lines that we talked about here. I was also impressed by the conclusion of the article. The establishment always screams bloody murder whenever President Trump threatens some other country. Well, the Guatemalans were supposed to sign this deal earlier. They pulled out, and the president said on Twitter on July 23rd, now we're looking at the ban, tariffs, remittance fees, or all of the above on Guatemala. Quote from the Times, Friday's action appears to suggest that the threats were effective. Guess what?
So.
When we don't play Uncle Sap, we're able to actually get some things to happen. But this is the scam that's keeping the border open, so it's very important that the administration is specifically focusing on the fact that these asylum claims are prima facie illegitimate, and these people are going to go back, in this case, to Guatemala. They're mostly from Honduras or El Salvador, because that's the first country they came to. They won't be sent home. They'll be sent back to Guatemala. If you want to apply for asylum, you have to apply for asylum there.
Right. And a lot of those countries have more stringent immigration laws than we do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that is a very interesting development. By the way, in case somebody is in the White House is listening to us, and I wouldn't write that off as impossible, I have another idea for the president, and it's a way he can make every American love him, whether they're from the far left to the far right. We are all plagued by endless robocalls. There's one company that was calling me multiple times a day, day after day, all of last week. And there's a way to stop this. Now, Congress is supposed to be doing something, but they want a technical fix, some device. The robocallers will have found a way around that before it's even implemented. Technical approaches aren't going to work. There is another approach that will, and that is simply to put a tax of $1 per robocall to be paid by the phone company that delivers the call. We can't tax these entities making the calls. They're overseas, they change their identities constantly and so on. But we can sure as heck tax the phone companies that are delivering the call. And if we put that tax in place, robocalls would cease overnight. All of them. It would kill.
This is change we can believe in.
This is change we can believe in, absolutely. And you would have the left as well as the right dancing in the streets, celebrating what a wonderful president we have, because he put an end to the worst plague that most of us are suffering from at the moment, the robocall plague. And this would work.
Give the people what they want.
I give the people what they want, and it would sail through the Democratic House overnight, as well as the Republican Senate. He could have the legislation on his desk in 72 hours if he proposed it, because any legislator who opposed it would be out in the next election.
You're not killing any jobs. It's all automated.
Yes, it's all automated. These are robocalls. You're not killing jobs at all. So anyway, if the White House is listening, you picked up on our idea about denial of asylum. Well, here's another one. And if they pick up on this one, then we'll know they're listening. So that's a good thing. It's been, I think, a very good week or a couple of weeks since our last show for President Trump. He also got a ruling from the Supreme Court that he can spend Defense Department money on the wall along our southern border. Now, isn't it interesting?
You would think.
Isn't it? Yes, exactly. That it took a Supreme Court ruling to allow the President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief to use money specifically appropriated for our defense to defend us against the actual invasion we're suffering. Apparently, we can spend hundreds of billions without a blink of the eye in the Hindu Kush, but God help us if somebody should want to spend a couple billions to stem the invasion that we're actually facing.
Right.
Nonetheless, he did win, and he is now cleared to spend, I think it's a couple $1 billion putting up a wall. The wall alone, I'll tell you right now, won't be enough. It needs high voltage electrified fences, it needs landmines, it needs automatic machine guns, it needs what we used to have on the old East-West German border. But the wall is at least a start.
Boats with
So-
alligators.
I like moat monsters. I've always been strongly moat monsters. I think that we should have moat monsters in the Rio Grande. Absolutely.
That's very, very traditional.
Right.
Well, and you wouldn't have any more pictures of the drowned little girl and father because they would have been eaten. Solve the problem, right?
Evidence gone.
No more tearjerker pictures, and the moat monsters are smiling. They had a good meal.
I see only upsides.
Only upsides, exactly. He also benefited tremendously. This was a brilliant political move, and it's classic Donald Trump because it was purely instinctual, and that's his attack on the Gang of Four, who I think
Squad.
It's the squad or the squaws. It seemed to be the squads would be more appropriate.
Interchangeably. Yeah.
But the Gang of Four is my favorite because that's the group built around Mao's widow that tried to take over China after Mao's death and would have completely wrecked the place. So by attacking the Gang of Four, and of course the establishment media was all wringing its hands. No, it was brilliant because he made them the public face of the Democratic Party, in effect enabling himself to run against them, whoever the nominee is. And all the other Democrats had to rally around these nutcases. So what is the public seeing from this? The public is seeing a Democratic Party that's represented by the Gang of Four, headscarf and all in one case. So I mean, absolutely brilliant move on the president's part. And even a columnist in the New York Times was saying that now when he goes out into the heartland, what he finds is people asking him worriedly, he will get reelected, won't he? Because the nightmare of any of these Democrats, as represented by the Gang of Four coming in, is such that the heartland, ordinary people are saying, God, we've got to make sure Trump gets reelected.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And of course they're right. But he benefited tremendously from that. My other news items, there is a piece in the New York Times today, Sunday, on the real conservative who is rising in British politics. And it's not Boris Johnson, who is more populist than a conservative. The real conservative is Jacob Rees-Mogg, a name most Americans have not yet heard, they will, who is so conservative, he steps right out of England between the wars in the way he dresses, in the way he speaks, and he very proudly represents everything we think of as traditionally English. No multiculturalism for him, quite the opposite. The Times writes his side-parted hair, his languid speaking style, and his baggy double-breasted suits give Mr. Rees-Mogg, a longtime lawmaker, an incongruously pre-war air. Yes, it's retroculture. It's retroculture for Britain. And he's wildly popular with the British grassroots, and he just became the leader of the House of Commons. So a very important post. And his initial directives to the civil servants in his office, non-titled males, those who are not Lord or Sir so-and-so, must be addressed as Esquire. Measurements should be imperial, not metric. Two spaces should follow a period.
Metric system, yeah, it just makes sense.
Imperial measurements are so wonderfully complicated. For example, an imperial gallon of gas is different from our gallon of gas. I'm hoping next it's wanting to go back to the pre-decimal currency, where you have 20 shillings to the pound and 12 pence to the shilling.
Wow.
Which will absolutely destroy every schoolboy's ability to figure change.
We're hard enough time with the decimal system.
But people in Britain are loving this guy, and they're loving what he represents. They're standing up and saying, yes, this was England, and we want this to be England again. So this Jacob Rees-Mogg has been written off by the political establishment as a weirdo, a kook, a crank, etc. Well, guess what? He's now the leader of the House of Commons. And when Boris Johnson goes down in flames, which I suspect won't take terribly long, I can see Jacob Rees-Mogg as prime minister. And that would be very interesting indeed.
Wow.
So all of these things are good news. It's interesting how much good news our side is getting politically. Now, beyond that, I have some interesting developments having to do with the military and specifically the Marine Corps. First of all, for all of our viewers and listeners who have an interest in fourth generation warfare and the fourth generation warfare handbook, my co-author of the handbook, Lieutenant Colonel Greg Thiel, U.S. Marine Corps, retired now, discusses fourth generation war on a podcast called PME Complete, PME Professional Military Education Complete. And I believe it's a Marine or former Marine who runs this podcast. And I know a lot of Marines watch it. So any of the rest of you who want to hear a good discussion by my co-author of Fourth Generation War, again, it's PME Complete. If you go there, you'll find it. Yeah, that's just recently. And that leads me to a very interesting document indeed, which I just got this week. The new Marine Corps Commandant's Planning Guidance. But Jeff, you said you also had something about the Marine Corps you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, it was just kind of a tie-in with an article I saw in the Center for National Interest about Russia is planning to use genetic testing to better place their soldiers in roles. So they'll be using genetics to assess the most unpredictable human qualities, how a person will react in combat. The project involves not only the assessment of physiological state, but also the prediction of human behavior in stressful critical situations, resistance to stress. So they're going to say, like, based on your test that we give you, you will be a tanker, you will be in the Navy, you will be a pilot. And just made me think of something that we talked about when I was in the Marine Corps for a little bit that was kind of wasn't really a taboo, but it's something that kind of came out after the fact. So when we were in the basic school, we were given, what we were told was just, a test about, general aptitude. Don't worry about it, just do your best. Well, it turns out it's an IQ test, and it's called the GCT test. It's been given since World War II, and it's called the General Classification Test. There's spatial reasoning, there's arithmetic reasoning, verbal reasoning, and you get a composite score. And I saw an article a few years ago that said that in World War II, a full 85% of people who took the test in 1980 got a score of over 120, which was the cutoff for Marine officers in World War II. Just 59% beat that score in 2014. So in World War II, just most people in the audience know, Marines either had to have a 4-year degree, which many people didn't, or they had to score above that cutoff to go through officer candidate school. So the point is that we're washing down the quality of our officer corps and the military in general by disregarding the fact that IQ is real and it is definitely a predictor for job performance and job success. Yes, we have the ASVAB. Yes, we have testing in flight school, yada yada. But the point is that generally speaking, the quality of our officers in terms of IQ has decreased drastically. And I think it's interesting that a country like Russia that doesn't have the same regard, I guess, for privacy and rule of law, they don't really have any qualms about doing these tests and then assigning soldiers to do their thing in the military. So that was just an interesting take I saw about what Russia's up to.
Well, the Commandant's Planning Guidance interestingly mentions that a majority of Marine enlistees now require a drug waiver.
But the majority.
A majority, yes.
Oh my gosh!
The figure's in here. I forget exactly what it is, but it was I think 70-some%.
Yeah, that's a wow.
So the societies get, in the long run, the governments and the militaries they deserve, and we've got, let's face it, a decadent society, and it's going to be very difficult to shield the military completely from that decadence.
Another area too, that another victim of cultural Marxism has been just general genetic studies,
yes.
Because they would want to block out any study that may infer that IQ is somehow genetic.
Yes, which of course we all know it is, and that there may be ethnic and racial differences, that there may be differences in the way men's and women's minds work. In fact, the more research is done on the human brain, the greater the differences they find between men's and women's brains.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
And of course, Jeff, you're familiar with the problem with women pilots. Not all of them, but a lot of them, that in general, a woman isn't as good at gauging spatial relationships as a man. I mean,
Sure.
simple test. 90% of all shopping carts in the grocery store left in the middle of the aisle are left there by women.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really, yeah.
Supported by science.
Right. Exactly.
It's really interesting you said that, because I remember distinctly in high school when we take, you take algebra, you take geometry, you take algebra 2, and I remember our geometry teacher, like plain as yesterday, saying, I've always found, because geometry knows the study of shapes, angles, three-dimensional stuff. She was like, I've always found that boys do a lot better in geometry than girls do, and girls, generally speaking, did better in algebra than men did, which is kind of what you were just saying, which I never really thought about connecting the two. That's really interesting.
Exactly. So anyway, the Commandant's guidance, and this is the new Commandant who just came in a couple weeks ago, General David H. Berger. This is very interesting indeed. And I'm not obvious, it's long, it's quite dense in content, and I'm only going to touch on a few aspects of it. And Jeff, this is something you raised on previous shows. On page 5, he says, I do not believe joint forcible entry operations are irrelevant or an operational anachronism. However, we must acknowledge that different approaches are required given the proliferation of anti-access, area denial, threat capabilities in mutually contested spaces. Visions of a massed naval armada 9 nautical miles offshore in the South China Sea, preparing to launch the landing force in swarms of ACVs, LCUs, and LCACs are impractical and unreasonable. We must accept the realities created by the proliferation of precision long-range fires, mines, and other smart weapons, and seek innovative ways to overcome those threat capabilities. Well, that's
sounds like you read my books.
Exactly. It comes right out of your book, in effect. And it is an acknowledgement of a reality the Marine Corps has long tried to ignore by putting its head in the sand, that we're not doing Tarawa again.
Right.
What the Commandant is calling for here is, in effect, a two-pronged approach. And that approach is somewhat problematic. On the one hand, he's saying the Marine Corps needs to be much more integrated with the Navy. On the other hand, he's saying we must diffuse and disperse our capabilities into a much larger number of platforms, including more smaller ships, with more focus on coastal waters, green water, brown water, etc. Well, he's right on both of those. But that's not where the Navy's going. The Navy, I have seen no evidence whatsoever that the Navy is prepared to move away from building a fleet to fight Imperial Japan, built around a small number of big aircraft carriers in what they now call carrier battle groups, traditionally carrier task forces, that are, of course, perfect targets for these area denial weapons, especially if, and it's China really we're talking about here. He makes it clear the Indo-Pac area is going to be the Marine Corps' focus, especially if, as I expect, they were to go nuclear at sea from the outset, as we found out after the Cold War the Soviets planned to do. That was quite a surprise for the US Navy. And the Chinese have every incentive to do that because they don't have any carrier task forces we can nuke and return. If they're going to go to war with us, virtually their whole surface Navy is going to be in port. Well, if we hit a Chinese port, kiss San Diego goodbye.
Huh.
So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. And I'm wondering if the Commandant is thinking that if the Marine Corps that gets itself much more involved with the Navy, that it can influence the Navy in moving toward, in fact, smaller platforms and larger numbers. This was an issue that I was in the forefront of the whole time I was on Capitol Hill as a Senate staffer in the 70s and 80s, trying to disperse the carrier force from a small number, essentially 12 big carriers, to a larger number of smaller ships. And the Navy then and now has shown no desire to do that. The Navy has shown no interest in coastal waters. I remember when Admiral Holloway, this was in the 70s, was Chief of Naval Operations, the reformers forced through a buy of PHMs, missile boats. And initially to be 30, the buy was cut to 6. And I remember Admiral Holloway sneering as he testified before the House Armed Services Committee, the US Navy has no place for little ships. So it's interesting that the Commandant has put these two together. I'm not sure how well that's going to work out.
What can you do about the F-35?
Well, I'm afraid there's no indication here of rethinking the F-35, because I'm sure his judgment is it's too far down the line. There's not much mention of it. It's referenced a couple times, but I think from his perspective, that's a fight that has already, even if he wanted to fight it, has already been lost. And that's unfortunate. It's going to leave Marine Air without an aircraft that can do the job that Marine Air is supposed to do, just supporting the guy on the ground. But I can see a Commandant making the decision saying, yeah, that was an issue that needed to be litigated 2 or 3 Commandants ago. It's too late. He talks a lot about people, and that's important because there's not much in this on equipment. It's much more people and idea focused. And this is, of course, the old rule of the military reform movement that John Boyd laid down. For winning wars, what is important is people, ideas, and hardware in that order. And on people, again, we're seeing some very new things here. He writes, the essence of all manpower systems is to encourage those you need and want to stay, and separate who are not performing the standards. Our current system lacks the authorities and tools to accomplish that simple outcome in anything but a blunt way. Our manpower model is based primarily on time and experience, not talent or performance or potential future performance. And of course, he's right. And he's talking about a new model, an incentives-based model, and he writes, while we hope this results in the retention of the most talented, our antiquated models may also retain poor performers. He talks a lot about the need to get rid of the duds. And Jeff, as you know all too well, the Marine Corps is no exception, and the other services are the same, in having a whole lot of duds as you go up in rank. In fact, I told General P.X. Kelly when he was Commandant many years ago, the higher you go in rank, the smaller the percentage of militarily competent officers, guys who can look at a military situation and know what to do, who can fight a battle or plan a campaign. Excuse me. There are a lot more militarily competent captains than there are militarily competent colonels. So the idea that we need to weed these people out is, I mean, it's an overdue one, but it's very interesting to me that it's in here because this is the kind of thing that's never been talked about before. And he also talks about, when he talks about fitness reports, upward growth and mobility must favor the most talented within our ranks while facilitating the identification of those with a special aptitude as instructors, educators, commanders, staff officers, mentors, or with special technical skills. This sounds like it's straight from Don Vandergrift's work. The current manpower model treats people as interchangeable. This says we're going to start looking at people as individuals. And for example, right now being a great instructor, a great educator in the Marine Corps means you're in a career dead end. There's no reward for that whatsoever. And he's saying we're going to change that. The whole report is very action-oriented. It's statements that we are going to change this, we are going to do these things. On education and training, again, some very interesting material. This is stuff that, Jeff, you and I and other people like us have been saying for years, but now it's coming from a Commandant, and this is really the first time we've heard anything like this from a Commandant since General Gray, who I believe was the 29th Commandant, and General Berger is I think it's the 38th, which tells you what a line of duds we've had for a long time. But he writes on education, I've noticed over the past several years that there is an increasing dissonance between what we are doing with regard to training and education and what we need to be doing based on the evolving operating environment. Specifically, many of our schools and training venues are firmly based in the lecture, memorize facts, regurgitate facts on command model of industrial age training and education. For our schools, it's more about the process of presenting information. And for our students, trainees, it is about what to think and what to do instead of how to think, decide, and act. What we need is an information age approach that is focused on active, student-centered learning using a problem-posing methodology where our students, trainees, are challenged with problems that they tackle in groups in order to learn by doing and also from each other. We have to enable them to think critically, recognize when change is needed, and inculcate a bias for action without waiting to be told what to do. Again, this coming from a commandant, this is very interesting indeed. He goes on to say, I'm committed to ensuring each of you is provided the best educational opportunity available. However, I am also committed to ensuring that the opportunity is as academically rigorous as possible and no longer consequence-free. Right now, everybody graduates. This will require changes in how we evaluate academic performance, as well as how we annotate success, mediocrity, and potentially failure via performance evaluations. Suddenly, people are going to be able to flunk out of EWS and command and staff and so forth. That's very interesting. Now, if you get in, of course, it's a free ride. You know, take your pack off, enjoy 9 fairly easy months memorizing processes, and everybody graduates. He goes on and talks about the same sorts of things with training. He says, as with our formal schools, we must enforce, this is on training, a more disciplined and rigorous assessment model in which not every unit passes, and for which there are both rewards and punishments for performance. I mean, in the old German army, it was quite easy to get relieved during an exercise or even a war game of command of your real unit if you were incompetent. And he stresses in bold type, training must be focused on winning in combat in the most challenging conditions. He talks a lot about the fact that training is only real if it is against a thinking opponent, i.e. free play. And he talks extensively about wargaming. In the context of training, wargaming needs to be used more broadly to fill what is arguably our greatest deficiency in the training and education of leaders, practice in decision-making against a thinking enemy. That's potentially revolutionary. Throughout the entire multi-billion-dollar-a-year American military education system, never at any level is an officer taught how to think militarily, how to look at a military situation, understand it, and know very quickly what to do. And that's what he's talking about here. So over and over and over, I've been in situations with Marines and with the other services where there's a very obvious military situation and they haven't a clue what to do. All they can do is follow some multi-step process, paint by numbers war, that they've learned in what's effectively dog training. So he's saying we have got to now start to teach how to think militarily. We have to put them in situations against a thinking opponent who can do anything he wants to defeat them under time pressure and see who can do it and who can't. So all of this, and there's a good deal more in here, is very interesting. Now, the paper is not without its weaknesses. The greatest, and this isn't a criticism of the commandant because he has no choice in this, but the greatest is that the whole strategic picture in which it operates is irrelevant because it's preparing for war with China or Russia. That also mentions Iran. We're not going to fight China or Russia because they're nuclear powers. Why do you think the US and the Soviet Union, through the whole of the Cold War, were so very careful never to directly engage each other's forces and acknowledge it? It happened. But both sides strenuously denied it. Because when you're dealing with nuclear powers, the loser is immediately under tremendous domestic pressure to escalate. Well, when you get on an escalation ladder with nuclear powers, you've got a problem. So that's fantasy land. But it's dictated to him by the so-called national defense strategy, which is purely a budget strategy, which identifies Russia and China as our enemies. The actual context in which the Marine Corps is going to be operating will be fourth generation war, because that's where war is going. But the kinds of reforms to personnel, education, training, et cetera, that he's talking about here carry over.
It's a good start.
It's those carry over. The specific relationship with the Navy may or may not, probably not. Most fourth generation opponents have obviously no capability at sea whatsoever. But all of these other points he's stressing carry over. So I think that this is on the whole a very hopeful document. And we may talk more about it on future shows, depending on what our audience is interested in. But this is the first real move toward reform after our repeated defeats at the hands of fourth generation opponents, that I've seen. There's not a glimmer of it in any of the other services. And a friend of mine who knows General Berger said he's tired of losing.
Wow. I can hardly believe what you just read there. That I am blown away. I am, for the first time in a long time, hopeful for the future of the Marine Corps. That's really impressive.
Yeah, if you can't get a copy otherwise, let me know and I'll make a Xerox and send it to you.
That's yeah. I think my book's on its way to the Commandant's reading list at this point.
You might have to do an expurgated version.
Yeah, exactly. It'll be the work-safe version.
But I like to think, even more importantly, maybe he's already read it.
Right. Yeah, well, that's good stuff. I'll dig into it as well.
For those of you who are not interested in the Marine Corps, sorry that we had so much material on this tonight, but this is important beyond the Marine Corps, because what it suggests is, at least in one service, a revival of military reform, without which the more money we spend, the deeper the hole we dig for ourselves.
Well, it's refreshing to see a results-based evaluation thought process, at least.
Yes, at least an attempt
Right.
to move toward one, as opposed to just shoveling more money into a bureaucracy in uniform.
Right.
So
Right.
Anyway, those are my items for this evening. Anybody else?
No, I talked about mine.
I was going to bring up the Supreme Court's ruling on the wall, so you stole that from me, Bill. But
Sorry about that, Brett. You should have given me.
Yeah, no, it's all right. John, did you have something?
I have one short piece that may or may not get any traction, but noteworthy, I thought, at least. Australia recently, this was this past week, I think the 26th of July. This is a Reuters article. I saw it in the New York Times as well. Australia seeks to dissect big tech algorithms and impose code of conduct to protect privacy. Now, it's a government imposing these things, so I'm always going to be questioning, is Google just paying them to decide what hate speech is and make it legal? Who knows? But Australia, I'll just read a little blurb from it. Australia has pledged to lift the veil on big tech's use of citizens' data, which is an extreme concern. Recently, we have there's a proliferation of this app called FaceApp that's being used. That basically you take a picture of yourself, it has filters on it. Everyone thinks it's a good time, but no one thinks what is all this data being used and collected in a place being used for? And of course, it's being sold to sell this stuff, just like everything
I don't think
else.
anybody had any idea that there was actually data being collected. Nobody ever reads the fine print on the terms and conditions, because they're
either that or they don't even
85 pages long. Yeah, that too.
Right. Yeah.
As one critic said about all this tech stuff, if you're not paying, you're being sold.
Yeah, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product, basically. Yeah. So it's refreshing at least to see a government that's calling out the big tech for what it is. So they're gonna empower a new branch of its antitrust authority to analyze how companies like Facebook and Google decide what ads and what content to show users. Australian Treasurer Josh Frydenberg told reporters on Friday they need to be held accountable for their activities and need to be more transparent. I would definitely agree with that. So
this is well, as conservatives, we need to be particularly leery of anything where these companies are saying we're banning hate speech. Because remember, the left's definition of hate is anything coming from the right.
right.
The cultural Marxists of the world champion haters, but it doesn't count as hate because it's coming from them. And this, of course, is Mark Cuse's so-called liberating tolerance.
Wow.
And we need governments, the current Australian government, that just got reelected is sort of a populist conservative government along the lines of President Trump. We need governments that will step in here and question these providers' definition of hate. Is it purely a partisan definition? Well, yeah, basically it is purely a partisan definition.
Yeah.
Should that be permitted? I think not. And I think it's appropriate for the government to say, wait a minute, you've got to offer a level playing field here.
Right. Yeah. All these big tech companies have basically taken the place of big banks. That they transcend borders, they transcend countries, they transcend all laws because everything goes through them. So at least it's refreshing to see at least somebody call them out for what they do. You know, Brent, like you mentioned, nobody's even thinking about this anymore. You know, and 10 years ago when Facebook came out, I thought it was really strange how people I would talk to in real life would tell me, "Oh, I saw you did this." I just always thought that was really strange that someone I haven't talked to in, you know, months, perhaps years, knows everything that's going on. But now nobody even thinks about that being an oddity. That's everyday occurrences. So it's interesting to see what has happened to our culture, and I think that's the real damage that's happened, is that nobody even realizes it anymore.
Well, remember that conservatives are always very leery of anything big, not just big government. We're leery of big corporations, big business, big media. Anything big has multiple disadvantages from a conservative perspective. It becomes the octopus, right? And the answer, of course, is antitrust, is break them up and force real competition with a much larger number of smaller entities. And to the degree we can, banks are a good example, put much more emphasis on local rather than national and international.
Right.
So I think the trust busting tools are there. It's a question of whether governments are going to use them.
Right.
I actually do have one piece of news, but before we go to it, I just want to remind everyone, if you have a question or comment, you can put it into the live chat. There's one or two that I'm going to pull out once I'm done with this bit of news that we'll get to. So this will be like the last call. Got a question or comment, put it in the live chat, and then I'll read it off after our last bit of news. So this one is, I like to put a little bit of a fluff piece at the end, but title of this is Lawmakers Want the Pentagon to Investigate a Bizarre Conspiracy Theory that the Government Weaponized Ticks and Spread Lyme Disease. And this comes from BuzzFeed News, so that would explain why the title is the way it is, but this is being reported in several different places. But the House of Representatives last week passed a voice vote passed by a voice vote, an amendment authored by Representative Chris Smith, a New Jersey Republican, to the House's massive defense spending bill authorizing the investigation into the possible involvement of DoD biowarfare labs in the weaponization of Lyme disease and ticks and other insects. And this goes back to a, again, quote unquote, conspiracy theory that the federal government was doing biowarfare research on Plum Island in New York, and this has been widely speculated that that Lyme disease came from one of these ticks that were being developed in this laboratory, and then when it was flooded during a storm or a hurricane, the ticks ended up getting out into the environment. And now, if you look on a map of the distribution of Lyme disease, it all starts right from like Connecticut, New York area and spreads out from there. So it seems very reasonable that it actually is where Lyme disease comes from.
It's really interesting.
But this is just one of several quote unquote conspiracy theories that are actually turning out to be true that are kind of coming out lately. So
right. I read a book. Go ahead, John.
Oh, you're good. No, go ahead.
I read a book a few years ago recommended by a friend. It's called Six-Legged Soldiers. I would highly recommend it, but it's about the influence of germs and diseases and bugs in warfare. And one of the most, and this is throughout history, but one of the most fascinating things to say that this isn't, I'm not commenting on whether this is true or not, what Brent just talked about, but World War II, the Japanese set up in a lab where they took they had rats and they injected the rats with bubonic plague, and then they had fleas that they were mass producing bite the rats. They canisterized the fleas by the hundreds of thousands, and then they dropped them into China. It killed 250,000 Chinese. Obviously, that's a blip in the radar when you kill millions of people. It's not really known about, but there's some fascinating stuff about the history of germ warfare. Like in World War II, United States manufactured like fake, I think like goat dung or something to drop into Libya, and then it had diseases in that, and the flies would get on it and then go bite the Germans. I mean, it's little stuff like that that has actually been done in the past. So I guess I wouldn't put it past conspiracy theorists that there might be something behind this.
Well, I think, Brent, if you think about it, the conspiracy obviously goes deeper. Think of the name BuzzFeed. Is that not itself run by ticks, obviously?
Well, clearly, there might be a conflict of interest there.
I was just going to say, 5 years ago, it was a conspiracy theory that fluoride was some kind of toxin, but it was revealed last year that it's a certified neurotoxin and it's in our tap water, and people drink it and bathe in it every single day.
And we're back to Dr. Strangelove, if you remember the movie.
No, I don't.
Fluoridating the water.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So there's no question that diseases have had tremendous influence on warfare throughout history, but for the vast majority of the cases, it was accidental, not deliberate. In other words, it was what happens when white Europeans go into areas where you have a lot of mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever. If you were a British naval officer in the 18th century sent to the West Indies, 1 chance out of 3 you were going to be dead before you returned to England from disease. Until, I think it was still World War II. It might have been World War I, but I think up to World War II, disease killed far more soldiers than did the enemy. The casualty list of my great-grandfather's regiment in the Civil War, 177th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, at the end of the war, was 86 dead, 2 to the enemy and 84 to disease. So disease has had, all kinds of diseases, have had tremendous effects on warfare in the past, but only a very small percentage of those cases was it intentional. It was simply the geography, the lack of understanding of what causes disease. It was essentially our successful war against malaria that enabled us to dig the Panama Canal. That's what had defeated the French previously there. The great Spanish victory at Cartagena in 1740, that where the greatest expedition ever to leave England under Admiral Vernon was defeated primarily because the locals and the Spanish soldiers who'd been there a long time had built up an immunity to the malaria and the yellow fever, and you had all these guys coming out from England who hadn't. And the Spanish held on under siege long enough for disease to do its work. And the British had to pull back because their army was just all dying from disease. So
it makes sense why the government would create a disease to spread on a foreign population to potentially use as a weapon.
Yes, and this is something that's been thought about and attempted historically going a long way back. It's shooting decaying animal carcasses by a trebuchet into enemy castles and stuff like that.
Trebuchet.
Yes. Someone once asked a guy who has a trebuchet, which he likes to use to throw pianos. They land quite spectacularly. If it would be possible for a human being to be shot up in the trebuchet and come down with a parachute, and the trebuchet owner said, oh yes, but he'd come down dead because the takeoff force is 40 Gs.
Oh,
Wow.
Your G suit wouldn't help much there, would it, Jeff? So
Yeah, that would not help.
not 40 Gs. So
No.
only a very small number historically of cases where battles, sieges, wars, etc., have been decided by disease, and there have been a lot of those. Has it had anything to do with intention?
It'll be interesting to see what happens with Lyme disease in the coming years, since we're not having quite the cold winters that we used to have, and that's what's kept ticks at bay. I imagine it'll start to spread some more as the general climate warms up a little bit.
Is Lyme disease the one where it starts as a circular looking thing around like your extremities, like your hands, arms?
Kind of like the plague starts.
Okay.
It's treatable at that point. After, if you let it get past that, it's very difficult to treat, and it is quite debilitating.
Yeah. So in any case, but I think the real conspiracy here is BuzzFeed itself, with that name, is obviously run by the ticks. So
there's more questions to be asked.
There are more questions to be asked, and the real conspiratorial question is, why are the ticks trying to create a conspiracy theory about themselves?
The plot thickens.
We may never know, but we'll have to revisit this in the future, I guess. Going to the questions from the live chat, we've got one from Chapman. He says, what advice does Mr. Lind have for currently serving officers about maintaining an overall successful career without undergoing the proverbial less invasive removal of their brain, spine, and balls?
The answer is it's difficult, because if you stand out from the pack by doing things like reading, learning how to think militarily, making military decisions, you're going to hurt your career. That's the current system. And yet, if you try to just keep all of this under wraps, hoping eventually that by the time you get a high enough rank, 06 or general officer, you can then put it all to work. By the time you've gotten there, you've lost it, because you've submerged it for so long that it's gone, and you've internalized the current system, which points to the need, obviously, to change the system. But what I would recommend is that you can always do the right thing with your subordinates. You can develop your subordinates militarily. You can create for them education and training opportunities that are realistic, again, up against a thinking opponent in any kind of training situation. You can introduce them to simple board war games. Squad leader is a great one for the NCOs and troops. You can almost always work with some of your peers. You will find that there are others who you can work with on a lateral basis, who see things the way you do, who want to, in effect, do what we know needs to be done in an effective military. Again, learning how to think militarily, how to act militarily, how to get results in a military situation. And sometimes you can work with your superiors, and sometimes you can't. A lot of the people I've worked with over the years in the service have found that if they go to their superior with ideas along the lines like, hey, let's start doing more free play training, let's get some of these board war games, organize board war gaming clubs, let the troops do that as part of duty hour, etc. That they just never thought of it. They're not against it. The thought had never occurred to them. They say, oh, it sounds kind of good, let's do it. So that's the best advice I can give. And then, of course, hope that someone like the new Marine Corps Commandant can change the system so that we begin to flesh out the officers with weak character, the careerists, the people who want to be something rather than do something. And we can start, in fact, promoting the kind of people who can get results in a military situation. That's what it comes down to. We've got to fix the system. And at least now we've got one service chief who's talking about doing that.
From Thermopylae 2007, to what extent might the appointment of such a Marine Corps Commandant be attributable to the Trump administration?
I don't know. I simply don't know. I don't know what the influences were that brought General Berger in. My hope,
you know anything of this guy?
not a lot. I know some people who know him. I have probably crossed paths with him over the years in the Marine Corps, in my work with the Marine Corps, but I don't remember names or faces well. And let's face it, Marines know they all look alike anyway. So sorry, Jeff, but yeah, you do too. The Trump administration obviously had to approve this. How much the White House actually knew of where he's coming from, I don't know. But my hope again, is that whether it comes from President Trump or elsewhere, that somebody at or near the top is tired of losing, as General Berger, at least so I've been told, is tired of losing. And God knows, maybe we could even get people at the heads of other services who are tired of losing. If so, then this could be the beginning of genuine reform. Too early to tell.
Russell Snow asks an important question. Does the Kaiser approve of Jacob Rees-Mogg?
The Kaiser approves very strongly. As I'm sure you know, Kaiser Wilhelm was as fluent in English as he was in German, which was very fluent indeed. He was a good speaker. And he loved England. He spent a great deal of time in England. And I can assure you he has been intensely distressed to see England overrun by a bunch of wogs. And he is delighted at the prospect of a real Englishman as prime minister. He is hoping that we could see an England that, again, he would recognize as England again, the England that he knew and very much loved.
A real Tory.
A real Tory, absolutely. The Kaiser's mother, of course, was Queen Victoria's eldest daughter. Queen Victoria died in the Kaiser's arms. The Kaiser in England were deeply intertwined. He could never even imagine the idea of war between Germany and England. And one of the great malefactors of 1914, Sir Edward Grey, essentially snookered the Kaiser into war. So Kaiser is very hopeful that Mr. Rees-Mogg will indeed become PM, and we will see an England that we recognize as England again.
Orion Scribe asks, will there be a follow-up or expansion of Victoria? I was thinking like using Bill Kraft's point of view and with hidden monarchies still in Europe, like when Kraft was given the Blue Max.
I have given some thought to that about the restoration in Europe as the globalist, culturally Marxist European establishment collapses and is replaced by something that's actually European and more than just European, that's specifically French and German and Austrian and so forth, that the future European Union just might be called the Holy Roman Empire under the head of the House of Habsburg. That might make a very interesting follow-up to Victoria. And yes, I have been thinking about that.
I got a question. Do you think that we should be trying to bring back the old royal houses since they lost power and they're, effectively gone and not within living memory for basically anyone at this point? Should we be trying to cultivate new bloodlines of royal houses?
Well, remember that the king's authority comes from God. So unless there's a pretty clear indication that God wants a different ruling house, I tend to think that if we want the lights that went out all over Europe in 1914 to come back on again, we need to bring back the old ruling houses, certainly in Austria and Germany and Russia. There's an excellent book on this by Professor Robert Kahn, who was at Rutgers when I was studying at Princeton, and I actually went up and did some work under him on the side, called The Problem of Restoration. And he was Austrian. And I would recommend the book for anybody who's interested in this. Yes, the memories are gone, but I think Europe is beginning to remember who it is, who it was, and who it's got to be again if again, names like Germany and France and Austria are going to mean anything. And I think that there will be a future generation that wants to look back and say, wait a minute, what did we have here with these monarchies? Of course, they were not absolute monarchies. Absolute monarchy historically is very, very rare. They would be constitutional monarchies. But the monarchy has the advantage that the head of state is about politics. So in times of national crisis, and Europe is moving into times of big national crisis, the country can rally around someone who is not a politician, who does not represent a party, who represents not only the nation as it is today, but the nation over time, member of a very old ruling house. And I think there may be growing interest in doing that. But I don't think Europe can ever recover what it was before 1914 without the restoration of the houses of Habsburg, Hohenzollern, and Romanov.
We lost most of ours after the end of the Civil War. A lot of the southern families, the aristocracy was largely lost after the Civil War. So we've also lost a lot of ours in the process.
Yes. And our aristocracy after the Civil War became a commercial aristocracy, which is a different matter altogether.
Oh, right.
There was in the old East Coast establishment a strong sense of noblesse oblige, a strong sense of duty. The old WASP culture of the East Coast had considerable merit, but that's largely gone now too. So in all of these cases, the problem of restorations, the problems facing restoration are significant. But I continue to think that if we're going to ever undo the damage that starts in August of 1914, we're going to have to go back to the world we had before August 1914. In effect, recreate a world where Archduke Franz Ferdinand lives.
Very good. That's all the questions we've got. Remember, if you want to participate in the show, questions, comments, article suggestions, topics, you can send all that to traditionalright@gmail.com, and we'll read it live. Thanks everyone for joining us. This was episode 20 of TR Live. We'll be back again every weekish for another edition. So thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Good night.
Godspeed.